Holy crap! Babe, wait up for me! Abby said to her fiance, Brandon, as she struggled to keep up with the pace that he set. He paused, turned towards her, and smiled. We're never going to make it to the top before sunset if you don't hurry up. You're a jerk, you know that? She said loudly as she ducked under a branch, finally catching up to him. Come on, we're almost there, Brandon said to her in a quieter voice. You're doing great, just a bit more. Did you have to pick such a difficult climb for my first hike? She asked him. It's not that bad, he said back with a knowing grin. It'll be worth it, I promise. They crested the final rise after walking a bit further. Abby gasped audibly and said to Brandon, Oh my God, it's so beautiful. The sun was almost to the tree line, casting long shadows among the trees. The leaf-strewn ground began to take on a golden hue as it dipped lower in the cool autumn sky. A small lake glimmered below them in the dying light. Brandon suddenly pulled apart from her and reached into his pack, startling her a little. Abby looked at him oddly for a moment as he fumbled around. He stopped digging after a few seconds. Looking up at her, he grinned widely. Abby Winters, Brandon said as he got to one knee, will you marry me? Abby began to cry a little, bringing her hands to her mouth. Yes, I will, Brandon Stevens. Elated, she allowed him to slip a modest ring onto her finger. The two embraced for a few moments, then turned to watch the sun fade till it was almost gone. Brandon set his pack down and pulled out a small lantern. If you want to get the stove going, I'll get everything else set up, babe. Okay, was all Abby said. She hadn't really been able to find any words since he had proposed. Their eyes met for a moment and they grinned, like a couple of kids on Christmas morning. They were laying under the stars, holding hands in the sleeping bags they had zipped together. The sun had long disappeared, and the moon now cast an eerie gray glow around them. Soft clouds occasionally drifted over them, turning everything dark except for the small circle of light radiating from the lamp. That was amazing, Abby said, turning her head towards Brandon, an obvious smile in her voice. They cuddled up a little bit closer, their faces touching. He stroked her hair and wrapped his legs around hers. Ouch! She said loudly and jerked back, giving him a light, playful slap on the chest. You really need to trim your toenails, dude. What are you talking about? He asked her, somewhat taken aback. I have my socks on. She paused for a moment and then quickly began to wiggle out of the sleeping bag on her elbows. What's wrong? He questioned her again. There's something in her bag, she said quickly. What is that? Brandon asked, starting to feel a tickling sensation rising up his leg. Brandon kicked out of the sleeping bag. Jumping up, he grabbed the lantern and turned it to full brightness. He lowered it into the opening of the sleeping bag. A centipede, about 7 inches long, crawled out. Each of his legs had to be at least a quarter the size of its body. The thing's antenna twitched in the air, searching. Brandon cursed under his breath. Kill it! Abby squeaked out. Do something! Brandon quickly glanced around, finding a flat rock by his feet. He brought the rock down on top of it as hard as he could, making a clear, crunching noise. He pulled the rock away, revealing a nasty, dark stain on the ground. Gross, was all he said as he brought the rock close to the lamp. What was left of the centipede that was stuck on the bottom of the rock jerked a few more times and then slid off. Is your leg okay? Brandon asked Abby. It's not my leg. It's my foot and it hurts. Please check out my foot. That stupid thing bit me. Brandon bent low with the lamp, examining her foot. Well, it's not the worst looking thing I've ever seen. At least you'll have something to remember tonight by. Hold on, I have some cream in my bag. Brandon walked to his bag and pulled out some ointment. He shoved the dead insect away with his foot as he came back. Okay, this should make it feel better, Brandon said as he popped the top and squeezed some onto his index finger. As he began to spread the gel over the bite, A soft lump shifted a little under his pressure. Brandon stopped for a second, unsure of what he actually felt. Cringing some inside, he glanced up. "Okay, I'll stay up and make sure nothing else gets you," he said with a forced grin. After he turned the sleeping bag inside out, no less than 3 times, and moved their site a few meters further down, Abby nestled back in an attempt to get some sleep. Brandon lounged in a camp chair next to Abby, occasionally bouncing his leg, watching her as she became more and more restless throughout the night. Brandon woke with a start, feeling something crawling up his leg. Quickly glancing down, his heart began to race. Nothing. He bent over and put his hands on his knees, attempting to slow his heart rate. Looking over to Abby, he saw that her face was lined with drops of sweat, and she had a pale color to her. The first tinges of worry began to creep into him. He shook Abby's shoulder gently. "Hey babe, how are you feeling?" he asked with concern in his voice. He shook her twice before she cracked her eyes open. "Like smashed up dog food," Abby said, forcing a crooked smile. "What time is it?" Looking up again into the sky, Brandon answered. It's probably around 7. I'm gonna go get some food and going for you. Let's get you sitting up first." Brandon brought the chair he had been in over. Helping Abby to her feet, he noticed that the spot where the centipede had bit her was at least double in size, now an angry, red welt the size of a quarter. He applied more of the ointment to her foot after she was seated, noticing that the lump he had felt before had disappeared. Brandon thought this was a little strange, but he shook it off. "Alright, we need to get going soon. I think we need to get you to a doctor. You look like you've been hit by a truck," Brandon said as he began heating a small packet of food for her. "No argument there," Abby said in a slightly shaky voice. I can still walk though. No need to airlift me out of here." Brandon looked over what had been their camping area, making sure all was packed up, and the two set off at a slow pace. They passed a spot where the dead centipede still was. A flat, bloodied body, still partly lying on the rock that had smashed it the night before. Torn apart limbs strewn about like a spider's broken limbs, its large antennas still searching. Brandon felt disgusted to see the thing in light and couldn't look away. "Brandon!" Abby broke him from his trance. "Come on!" "Yeah," he said, finally looking away. "Let's go." Abby had quite a bit of trouble navigating at times during the hike back, but Brandon didn't tease her like he had done the day before. They had to stop a multitude of times during the hike to their vehicle, him inspecting her foot each time. He was becoming increasingly concerned. The bite was no longer a quarter-sized welt anymore, but now covered most of the top of her foot and had sent dark red, spidery lines halfway up her leg. Brandon had to help her limp the last few hundred feet back to the car, leaning her against the hood when they arrived. He packed all of the gear into the car, helped her to the passenger side, and hopped behind the wheel. Abby, who now complained of having shooting pains running from her leg to her neck, lay back in the fully reclined passenger seat, sweating profusely. "Hang on, babe. We're going to the emergency room," Brandon said to Abby, his apprehension shooting up as he watched his fiancée begin to writhe in agony. After fumbling with his phone's map application to find the nearest hospital, he slammed his foot on the gas pedal, the car biting into the gravel for traction, racing down the road towards the main highway. He noticed Abby had become still. "Abby? Abby!" He had to yell to get her attention. She cracked her eyes a bit. "Yeah?" she said through pale lips. "Don't do that to me," he said, his eyes wide with fear. "We're about 30 minutes from the hospital in Ashton." "No rush, babe. I'll be fine," she said, obviously trying to crack a joke. Brandon didn't reply. He drove at dangerous speeds on the nearly deserted highway, passing 120 at times. Trees flew by in the blur as motorists veered to the side to avoid him. He made it to Ashton in less than 15 minutes. The hospital was just inside the city limits, so after taking a few short turns, they found themselves outside the emergency room in no time. He rushed inside, frantic to find help. My wife, she needs help, please! Brandon almost screamed as he struggled to find words. Okay, sir, what seems to be the problem? The attendant at the front desk asked politely. My wife, she needs help! He did yell this time. A security guard that had been sitting down, reading his paper, stood up. Sir, please, he said. Get a stretcher! She's out in the car! Brandon interrupted the guard. By this time, orderlies had begun to jump into action, rushing out to the car. Brandon followed. He was not prepared for the change in Abby when he went back outside. Abby was now completely catatonic, laying in the car. She was staring blankly at the roof, her mouth open in a rictus of suffering. Brandon looked her over. What is that? He said quietly. Abby's lower midsection was slightly bloated, the buttons on her shirt strained, wicked-looking red streaks on her neck reaching towards her face. Okay, get a stretcher out here, now! One of the orderlies yelled. Brandon backed away so they could take her inside. They quickly rushed her to a private room. Brandon was pulled to give the front desk attendant some information. You say she was bitten by a centipede? The woman asked. Yes, we were hiking last night and she was bitten, Brandon answered, exasperated. Okay, sir. Would you mind? She was cut off as someone banged the ER door open and called for Brandon. Sir, your wife is asking for you. I think you need to come see her, they said, seeming to struggle for words. The nurse hurried back through the door, Brandon close behind. They turned a few corners and finally arrived at Abby's room. He stopped just inside the door, staring in disbelief at Abby. She was almost unrecognizable. Her face, now bloated as well, was flushed red, dark red splotches covering it. Breathing tubes had been inserted into her nose, and she had been hooked up to an IV. Her shirt lay open so they could inspect the swelling, blistering skin lesions that were forming in many places. What is happening? He said with confusion, looking at the nurses. We don't know, one nurse with a shaky voice kept repeating. A loud crack filled the room, and they all looked at the bed. Abby, her back now snapped into two, was arched like a triangle. One of the nurses turned to the side and vomited. What is happening? Brandon muttered in abject horror. Abby's stomach began to throb uncontrollably, black, spindly arm-like appendages becoming visible through her skin. Her chest turned a wicked blood color. Her limbs contorted to impossible angles, and gore flew everywhere as her body split in two down the middle with a sick, slicing noise, her head sliding to one side. Something out of a nightmare emerged from what was once a human being. Large, blood-red appendages bent out at every angle, ending in points as sharp as knives. Bits of Abby sloughed off the thing's body as it rose to its full height on the hospital bed. Brandon couldn't comprehend what he was seeing. Abby, he said as he sank to his knees in spreading blood, his hands covering his face, trying to block out the horror from in front of him. Brandon began sobbing. The nurses clambered out of the room, falling over each other. One of the nurses hit her head on the door's threshold as she fell with a ringing whack. The thing turned its head toward the noise, and Brandon finally got a good look at this thing in its entirety. The thing was at least 7 feet tall, pincers the size of Brandon's arm at the bottom, 2 enormous antennae on top, an impossibly large mouth held equally sized fangs pointing inward. Brandon threw up in his hands as he saw Abby's face melting off of one of its teeth, hanging from her mouth. Brandon fell to his side, unresponsive, but still seeing everything. His eyes became focused as the thing slid off the bed with soft clinks, pulling the soaked sheets with it. He heard soft purring noises as the monster approached, noticing before he blacked out the tiny, segmented bodies of the things crawling in the wet bed sheets. Under their mother.